In the heart of America, between the country's two greatest rivers, stretches a vast expanse of flat farmland and picturesque rolling hills. This is a land of small towns and small cities, yet one key to feeding and fueling the United States. A humble, rural state often overlooked, yet it picks presidents. Iowa is, in a sense, quintessential Middle America. To experience it is to understand what America imagines itself to be. So come with me to the heart of the Heartland, and let's explore a place outsiders often forget, overlook, yet one quite deserving of our attention. Iowa is the 30th place I will cover in the U.S. Explained, a 56-part series into every state, territory, and federal district in the country by order of admission. On this beautiful day, I'm at the Iowa State Capitol here in downtown Des Moines, right in the heart of the state of Iowa. Excited to bring you the U.S. Explained, episode 30, Iowa. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host, Carter. This is the U.S. Explained, episode 30, Iowa. According to the Köppen climate classification, most of Iowa, like much of the northern U.S., sits in the hot summer humid continental climate zone, with 4 distinct seasons, hot summers and cold winters, while parts of the state's northeast, near the Wisconsin border, sit in the colder, warm summer humid continental climate zone. Iowa ranks 29th out of the 50 states by dew point, a measurement of how sticky the air feels, making it about average in terms of humidity. It's roughly in the middle in terms of precipitation, too, receiving in a given year about 34.5 inches of rainfall and 31 inches of snowfall, 34th and 20th out of the 50 states, respectively. Northwestern Iowa, closest to the Great Plains, generally gets less rainfall than the south and east, while the north of the state, unsurprisingly, gets more snowfall than the south. With an average temperature of 48.14 degrees Fahrenheit or 8.97 degrees Celsius, it's the country's 14th coldest state. It's right in the middle again, 26th, in terms of average annual sunlight. It's a Midwestern state, so Iowa can get some pretty crazy weather. Winters can be freezing, and the Hawkeye State has been hit by major blizzards and snowstorms. In this agricultural giant, droughts can be devastating, as can flooding on the major rivers that flank the state. Some of the most common natural disasters in Iowa, though, are tornadoes. Cold air moving southeast from the Rockies meets hot air moving north from the Gulf of Mexico, clashing over the Great Plains and Midwest and creating storms capable of forming tornadoes. Iowa sits right in Tornado Alley, this stretch of the country where they often form. In an average year, Iowa gets hit with 53 tornadoes, 8th most out of the 50 states, but the state is even more prone to strong tornadoes. Since 1950, 51 EF4 and EF5 tornadoes, the strongest tornado classifications, have touched down in Iowa. Only Oklahoma and Texas have had more. The entire state sits squarely in the central time zone. The name of the state comes from a native people, the Bakgoje, or people of the gray snow, who lived in the region. Other nearby Siouan peoples referred to them as the Iowa, or sleepy ones, a word French explorers and trappers pronounced Iowa. Later, English-speaking settlers anglicized the name to Iowa or Iowa, giving it to both the people and a tributary of the Mississippi River that passed through their territory. When the region was split off of the Wisconsin Territory in 1838, the new territory was named Iowa for the river. Iowa is nicknamed the Hawkeye State. The nickname was popularized by 2 promoters in the town of Burlington who worried that neighboring territories would pick insulting nicknames for Iowa, something that had been the case in other states like Minnesota and Michigan, decided to choose their own instead, one that sounded impressive and inspiring. They settled on Hawkeye, perhaps paying tribute to 2 famous Iowans they were friends with, Sauk leader Black Hawk and Stephen Sumner Phelps, a fur trader nicknamed Hawkeye. or to a character of the same name in the book The Last of the Mohicans, which was popular at the time. Iowa's license plate shows a blue stripe with a white silhouette of the Des Moines skyline and a farm scene at the top and a green field at the bottom. Iowa's flag contains 3 vertical bars, thinner blue and red bars on the left and right, and a wider white bar in the middle, with a flying eagle holding in its beak a blue banner reading, "Our liberties we prize, and our rights we will maintain." Beneath it is the word Iowa in red. The tricolor is an homage to the state's history as a territory of France, the colors symbolizing loyalty, purity, and courage. I visited Iowa as part of my U.S. Explained tour, where I traveled across the country taking photos and videos in most of the states and territories I had left to cover, seeing America as I worked on this series. In Iowa, I spent time in Des Moines and Council Bluffs. I didn't get as much time in the state as I would have liked, but I've visited before, enjoyed my time there, and honestly would love to be back. I took a number of photos and videos in this tour that I included in this video, including the thumbnail. If you can guess where it is, leave a comment and let me know. I think this will be a pretty easy one. Taking up 55,857 square miles, or 144,669 square kilometers, Iowa is the 23rd largest state in the country by area, right in the middle of the 50 states. It's larger than Illinois, but smaller than Michigan, about the same size as Nepal. 3.207 million people live in the state, placing it in the middle but on the smaller side at 31st out of the 50 states by population. It's larger than Nevada, but smaller than Utah, giving it a population similar to Bosnia or Armenia. Iowa's population surpasses that of the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico by just 2,000 residents, making it by population the smallest state in the U.S. with more people than Puerto Rico. The state's population density, too, is also towards the middle but on the sparser side. With 57 people per square mile, or 27 per square kilometer, it ranks 37th in terms of population density, or is the 14th most sparsely populated state in the country, more densely populated than Maine and more sparsely populated than Colorado, a similar population density to Bhutan or Papua New Guinea. Iowa sits right in the center of the country, towards the northern half, in the region known as the Midwest. It's maybe the most quintessentially Midwestern state. The popular conception of the Midwest, farmland, small towns, stretch across most of the state. To the east in Illinois are Great Lakes and major cities. To the south in Missouri are the forests and mountains of the Ozarks. To the west in Nebraska are the higher, drier Great Plains, and north in Minnesota are the forests and lakes of the North Woods. The landscapes of Iowa, right in the middle, are very classically Midwest. In fact, Vox put out a survey asking people what states they consider to be part of the Midwest, and 95% of respondents said that Iowa was Midwestern, the most of any state. At least by public perception, it's very Midwestern. It borders 6 different states. Minnesota sits to the north, Wisconsin to the northeast, Illinois to the east, Missouri to the south, Nebraska to the west, and South Dakota to the northwest. The entirety of the state's eastern border is formed by the Mississippi River. It begins in the hills and ravines of the region known as the Driftless area, near the town of New Albin, initially a border with Wisconsin. Across the river from the city of Dubuque, it changes to a border with Illinois, the suburb of East Dubuque sitting on the Illinois side. As the river weaves its way south, carving out the state's distinctive shape, it separates a cluster of cities, both on the Illinois and Iowa sides of the border, known as the Quad Cities. This small urban area along the Mississippi is the second largest anchored in the state, with 285,000 people living in both the Iowa and Illinois sides of the Quad Cities, although there are only roughly 175,000 living on the Iowa side, making it the third largest located fully within the state. 2 of the Quad Cities, Davenport and Bettendorf, are on the Iowa side, and another 3, Moline, East Moline, and Rock Island, sit on the Illinois side. Yes, there are 5 Quad Cities. Though each of the cities form their own core with their own distinct downtown, Davenport is by far the largest of the 4 cities and is the main urban core of the region. Further south, near the town of Keokuk, the state ends at the mouth of the Des Moines River, Missouri sitting to the south. The Iowa-Missouri border briefly follows the Des Moines River upstream to near the town of Farmington, where it leaves and stretches west for 211 miles or 340 kilometers, Missouri sitting to the south, until it reaches another of the country's great rivers, the Missouri. Across the Missouri River to the west sits Nebraska. Nebraska's largest city, Omaha, sits along the river, its downtown right across from Iowa. The Iowa suburbs of Omaha are home to 66,000 people, making it the ninth largest urban area in the state, slightly smaller than Ames. Council Bluffs, the Iowa side's largest city, is actually older than Omaha, though its counterpart to the west wound up outpacing its growth. The beautifully named town of Carter Lake is an Iowa suburb of Omaha that actually sits west of the Missouri River. Wedged between the river and an oxbow lake that formed when the Missouri changed course, the old path of the river remains the border between the states, creating a weird situation where, never crossing the river, you can cross state lines just by driving into what feels like a neighborhood of Omaha only a few minutes from downtown. Of course, I had to pay it a visit.
Right now, I'm in the town of Carter Lake. Now, besides its name, what's so great about this town? It feels very much like a neighborhood of Omaha. Just a 10-minute drive from downtown, you can see the skyline pretty well for most of it, and we're here in the Nebraska side of the river. But Carter Lake is actually part of Iowa. This lake you see behind me was once a natural bend in the Mississippi River, but floodwaters cut the bend off and turned it into this oxbow lake, giving it a part of Iowa right here on the Nebraska side of the border. So this is an Iowan city that's completely disconnected by land from the rest of the state.
Further north along the Missouri, Sioux City is the state's sixth largest urban area, home to 113,000 people in it and its suburbs, roughly 90,000 of whom live on the Iowa side. It sits right near the meeting point of Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota, and has suburbs in both of the two other states. Interestingly enough, while Sioux City is in Iowa, South Sioux City is in Nebraska, and North Sioux City is in South Dakota. Just outside Sioux City, the Big Sioux River flows into the Missouri, and the Iowa border follows this tributary further north. South Dakota, not Nebraska, now sitting to its west. Just outside South Dakota's largest city, Sioux Falls, the border leaves the river and turns east, South Dakota briefly sitting to the north for just 7 miles or 11 kilometers. From there, the border changes. Minnesota, now sitting to the north, their border stretching 262 miles or 422 kilometers east to the Mississippi River. Iowa is one of just a few states that lies fully within the watershed of a single river, the Mississippi. Whether through tributaries like the Des Moines that flows down through the center of the state, the Cedar, Iowa, and Wapsipinicon in the east, or the Big Sioux in Missouri in the west, all the rain that falls in Iowa eventually flows out to sea in the Gulf of Mexico. And like the Mississippi and Missouri, most rivers in the state generally flow north to south. If you think geography of Iowa, you probably think flat. And you wouldn't be wrong. The highest point in the state, Hawkeye Point, is just a flat section of land just south of the Minnesota border. If you just think Iowa is flat, though, chances are it will surprise you. I remember the first time I drove across the state, I was struck by the scenic beauty of its gentle rolling hills and valleys. Particularly having just driven across northern Illinois, which was very flat, I was struck by how the landscape changed on the other side of the Mississippi. While more recent glaciation left the north of the state flatter, as those glaciers melted, the streams that drained them carved out small valleys in the plains to the south and left behind deposits of soil and sediment that give southern Iowa a landscape marked by gentle hills and valleys. I-80 is a pretty good dividing line between the hillier south and flatter north, though there are exceptions. Prime among them, in the northeast along the Mississippi River, a region called the Driftless area stretches into the state, spanning part of northeast Iowa as well as parts of Minnesota, Illinois, and much of Wisconsin. The Driftless area is one of the most unique parts of the Midwest, a part of the region untouched by the ice sheets. It looks and feels very different from the rest of Iowa and the Midwest, home to forest-covered hills, sharp gullies and ravines near the Mississippi River. A glimpse into what the Midwest would have looked like before glaciation, it has a landscape and, interestingly, even flora and fauna that have more in common with New England than the rest of the agricultural Midwest. Pikes Peak, named by Zebulon Pike a year before he named the more famous mountain in Colorado, is the highest bluff anywhere along the Mississippi River, and the region is sometimes nicknamed Little Switzerland. The beautiful region is, along with the south of the state, home to some Amish communities as well, giving Iowa the 9th largest Amish population in the country. It's a country of smaller farms, hilly forested bluffs, and river towns that share a lot in common culturally with neighboring parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. On the western border, the Missouri River Valley is a flat, low, alluvial plain bordered by the Luss Hills, a ridge of silt deposited in the valley by the Missouri and blown by the wind into a rise of sharp, sandy hills. While yes, much of the state is pretty flat, it is also home to beautiful hilly regions, each of which are different in their formation and feel from one another. Visit Iowa and it's hard not to take in its beauty. Not the splendor of a beach or canyon or snow-capped peak, but an idyllic beauty, one seen in the barns and ponds and pastures and silos that dot the curving hilltops, the covered bridges that carry a country road over a little creek, or a red sunset over the cornfields. I think it's all pretty special. Nearly all of the state's land is agricultural. The prairies and forests that once spanned the state, even in the hillier areas, have mostly been converted to farmland. Though there are small farms in the state, particularly in the driftless area, ag is big industry in Iowa, and much of the state is made up of large-scale industrial farming operations. Crops and livestock dominate in the state, and there are three big ones: corn, soy, and hogs. In Iowa, corn is king. Of course, we all love popcorn and corn on the cob, but most corn grown in the U.S. isn't consumed by people, but turned into feed for livestock. Much of the meat we consume is raised on corn-based feed, and much of that corn is grown in Iowa. Corn is by far the largest crop produced in the United States, both by acres harvested and the money brought in from its sale, and Iowa is the country's #1 corn producer. 2.6 billion bushels of corn are harvested in the state every year, 16% of all corn grown in the United States. It isn't just used for feed. The state's been at the forefront of the ethanol revolution, and today a third of the state's corn is converted into the renewable fuel, which often makes up a significant proportion of the gasoline that powers our cars and other machinery. Soybeans used in livestock feed and cooking oils are the country's second largest crop, and Iowa is, after neighboring Illinois, the U.S.'s second largest soybean producer. On top of that, for every one person living in Iowa, there are 7 pigs. 22.6 million in total, raised often in major industrial farming operations. A third of all hogs and pigs in the United States are raised in Iowa. Iowa is the country's largest pork producer and is a major producer of chicken, dairy, and oats. Altogether, this major agricultural presence means this small state punches well above its weight in a key industry in the country. It's the second largest agricultural producer of any state in the U.S. after just California, a state 3 times its size. Iowa is an agricultural giant in the heart of America. Much of its major manufacturing sector revolves around agriculture as well, whether production of farm equipment, meat packing, food processing, and of course, ethanol. Because so much of Iowa consists of farmland, the state has some of the fewest trees of anywhere in the country. Only 8% of Iowa is covered by trees, making it America's 5th least forested state. Only the Great Plains states of North Dakota, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Kansas proportionally have less tree cover. Even the desert state of Nevada is nearly twice as forested as Iowa. The state's population is distributed fairly evenly across its regions, a rarity in most states. While of course there are larger cities and smaller towns, any given rural part of the state isn't significantly more or less densely populated than another. Much of Iowa is rural, but none of it is remote. Its largest urban areas, all of which are smaller cities, are spread across different parts of the state. In the west, Sioux City, with 113,000 people in it and its suburbs, 90,000 on the Iowa side, is the 6th largest Iowan urban area, sitting at the meeting point of the Big Sioux and Missouri rivers across from both Nebraska and South Dakota. Council Bluffs, further downstream, sits right across the Missouri from downtown Omaha near the Luss Hills. Western Iowa, historically more politically conservative and culturally similar to neighbors like South Dakota and Nebraska, sits along the valley of the Missouri River and is connected through it to communities up and down the river in the states of the Great Plains. The East, meanwhile, has historically been more industrial, politically liberal, and connected culturally to the neighboring states of the Mississippi Valley, like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. In the east, Dubuque sits along the Mississippi in the driftless area, and further downstream, Davenport anchors the Quad Cities, whose 175,000 residents on the Iowa side make it the 3rd largest urban area in the state. In the east as well, Waterloo and nearby Cedar Falls, together home to 114,000 people, the fifth largest urban area in the state, sit along the Cedar River, while further downstream sits Cedar Rapids, the state's second largest urban area, home to 192,000 residents in the city and its suburbs. Just south of Cedar Rapids on the Iowa River, Iowa City, its 126,000 residents, making it the state's fourth largest urban area, was Iowa's old territorial capital city, today a vibrant college town home to the University of Iowa, the largest university in the state. The Amana colonies in the region are an old settlement of around 3,000 religious Germans that live throughout a scattering of small towns and speak their own unique dialect of German called Amana German. They left Germany for Iowa in 1855, and for nearly a century, Ammonians built an isolated, self-sufficient local economy, living and owning land communally until the Great Depression. They even founded the Fridge Company Amana and are today a popular tourist destination. Southern Iowa is home to towns like Burlington, Muscatine, and Keokuk on the Mississippi, as well as Osceola and Ottumwa further into the state. Northern Iowa is home to Mason City as well as Okoboji, a string of lakes nicknamed the Iowa Great Lakes near the Minnesota border that are a popular spot for Iowans to vacation. The heart, both geographically and culturally, of the state, central Iowa is home to the towns of Fort Dodge, the college town of Ames, home to Iowa State, and of course Des Moines, the Iowan capital, which with a population of 542,000 people is easily the largest city in Iowa. Right in the middle of Iowa, it's the 78th largest urban area in the United States, larger than Akron, Ohio, and smaller than New Haven, Connecticut, and really the only place in the state that can be considered a major city, though a smaller one nonetheless.
Right in the center of the state, Des Moines is Iowa's state capital and its only major city. It's a great city, home to a beautiful skyline and an incredible Capitol building with 5 gold domes. Well, 1 gold dome, 5 domes total, and they offered me free ice cream in the inside, so I cannot complain.
Tens of thousands of years ago, vast sheets of ice spanned much of the northern hemisphere. So much of the Earth's water was contained in these sheets that sea levels sat far lower than they do today, and land was exposed that today rests beneath the waves. In the Bering Sea, separating Alaska from Siberia, a land bridge connected North America to Asia. Across it, or along its coastline by ship, the ancestors of North and South America's indigenous people arrived and settled a hemisphere. As they made their way south through the Arctic, they formed countless societies, civilizations, and ethnic groups, speaking over 1,000 languages in numerous different language families. Along the Mississippi River, people living in what we call the woodland period built large mounds in Iowa shaped like animals, what we call the effigy mounds. The archaeological record tells the story of an ancient culture known today as the Mississippians. Living in agricultural communities, constructing great cities marked by massive earthen mounds, and conducting trade across the continent, the Mississippian culture long dominated much of what is now the United States. The northern Mississippians, known today as the Oneota, lived throughout what would become Iowa. Perhaps it was disease introduced by early Spanish explorers who encountered the Mississippians, like Hernando de Soto. Perhaps it was war. Perhaps they had over-depleted the region's resources, or some combination of the three, but by the time later European colonists, like the British and French, made their way to the middle of the continent, the Mississippians were long gone. Ruins, all that were left of their great cities of old. Of course, they did not actually go anywhere. After the collapse of Oneota society, their descendants remained, still in the same region. Though they emerged into different ethnic groups, different cultures, and societies, they continued to speak related, sometimes the same languages, what became known as the Siouan language family. All the native people living in Iowa before European colonization spoke Siouan languages. In the north lived the Wahpeton and Yangtze branches of the Dakota, who were part of a political confederation with the neighboring Nakota and Lakota peoples called the Oceti-Sakowin, or Seven Council Fires. The French would collectively call them the Sioux. In the Mississippi Valley to the east lived the Ho-Chunk, or Winnebago. 2 groups that split off of them, Oto and the Missouri, lived in the south, and the Bakojay, or Iowa, who would lend their name to their homeland in the center. A tribe called the Hoga, leaving the Ohio Valley, came into Arkansas, where they become known as the Quapaw. Other groups of Hoga would continue further north along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers in what have been dubbed the Daghechon migrations. Their descendants would become the Osage in Missouri, Kaw in Kansas, and crossing through Iowa, the Omaha along what is today the Iowa-Nebraska border, as well as the Ponca further north. French colonialism and tribal warfare further east would drive other tribes west into Iowa. Members of a confederation called the Illiniwek, or Illinois, would cross in from what is today the state of the same name, as would the Sauk and Meskwaki, or Fox, from Wisconsin. In 1673, a French Jesuit missionary named Jacques Marquette and a French-Canadian fur trader named Louis Joliet set off from St. Ignace, a French colonial outpost in what is now the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They set off across Lake Michigan, traveled down the Wisconsin River, and met the mighty Mississippi in what is now Iowa. They would be the first Europeans to set foot in it. A few years later, another French explorer, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, would claim the entire Mississippi Valley for France, calling it La Louisiane. La Salle would never reach Iowa or the upper reaches of the valley at all, but a member of his expedition, Flemish missionary Louis Hennepin, would, after being captured, brought north, and later freed by the Dakota. On paper, Louisiana would change hands, becoming Spanish in 1763 following the French and Indian War, then returning to French control briefly in 1801. But this meant relatively little for the people who lived there. France's colonial project in North America revolved around the fur trade, and the colonial population of Louisiana lived mostly in the South, in cities along the lower reaches of the Mississippi River, like New Orleans and St. Louis. There were no French cities in Iowa, surprisingly not even any French forts. French traders like Julien de Buch set up shop in the region, trading pelts with local native people and selling them downriver in St. Louis, but no forts or settlements developed. There were forts and trading posts across the river, such as Prairie du Chien in French Canada, which would become British after the French and Indian War, bringing British fur traders across the Mississippi, but none during France's reign in what would become Iowa. Other than Ohio and Tennessee, this makes Iowa one of the first states I've covered where Americans, not Europeans, were the first major colonial presence in the region. By 1803, Napoleon's France, militarily distracted and in dire financial straits due to a revolution in their Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, found itself unable to protect this vast, mostly wilderness territory that it had just purchased back from Spain. After the victory of Britain's rebellious 13 Atlantic colonies in the Revolutionary War, the new United States had won not just their own independence, but gained control of British territory all the way up to the Mississippi River. Needing money and not wanting to deal with the defense and administration of such a massive territory, France sold Louisiana to its new neighbor. With the stroke of a pen, La Louisiane became American, and the new country nearly doubled in size, to this day the largest expansion of territory in U.S. history, besides the country's initial independence. On paper, the United States was a massive country, but in practice, much of the new Louisiana territory was controlled by the native peoples who'd continued to inhabit the land, despite the devastating effects of diseases brought from Europe. In what would become Iowa, the Sauk and Meskwaki were particularly powerful, dominating the area around both sides of the Mississippi River. It wasn't until 1808, 5 years after the Louisiana Purchase, that the United States would gain any sort of real foothold in the region. Worried about increasing tensions with Britain, a country that still did not fully accept American control of much of their former territory, the U.S. constructed a fort on the west bank of the Mississippi River, naming it Fort Madison, an outpost from which to control the ever-prominent fur trade in the region and defend against a hostile neighbor to the north. It was, alongside 2 forts in what is now Missouri, the first of 3 American forts built in the Louisiana Territory, and at the time the only in the territory's north. In 1812, Louisiana became a state, and the Louisiana Territory was renamed the Missouri Territory. That same year, war broke out against Britain, and Fort Madison became a target. In 1813, Sauk and Meskwaki, allied with the British, raided and destroyed the fort on their behalf, ousting the American garrison from their homeland. In the only battle of the War of 1812 fought west of the Mississippi. The war, however, ended in something of a draw, and the region remained in American hands. In 1821, Missouri became a state, and the rest of the Missouri Territory, including what is today Iowa, was reclassified as unorganized territory. The Sauk and Meskwaki lived on both sides of the Mississippi, but the U.S. was trying to bring white settlers onto these lands, particularly those to the east of the river, in places like the state of Illinois. One way they would do so was through treaties. Often these treaties were deceptive and misleading, or would be signed by a native representative who lacked the authority to actually trade away as much land as they did. One such treaty, signed in 1804, had supposedly given significant Sauk territory in Illinois to the federal government. Many Sauk disputed this, and in 1829, when President Andrew Jackson, a major proponent of so-called Indian removal, notified the Sauk and Meskwaki that they would have to vacate their territory east of the Mississippi and resettle in their lands to the west, they were furious. In 1832, a Sauk leader named Black Hawk refused to leave, trying to take back his hometown from the U.S. and preserve Sauk's sovereignty of his homeland. The U.S. and a number of native tribes who were enemies of the Sauk and Meskwaki pursued and eventually defeated Black Hawk and his followers in what was known as Black Hawk's War, and as part of the settlement, would force them to give up much of their lands west of the Mississippi as well. They were moved further west, where the government constructed a military installation called Fort Des Moines to guard against a potential uprising, and not long after were forced southwest into Indian Territory. Black Hawk himself would become a popular figure in the United States. On his way to and from prison in Virginia, Andrew Jackson ordered that Black Hawk be taken to see the cities of the East Coast, to frighten and impress upon him the power of the United States. Instead, he was met with throngs of adoring crowds. He would write a book, one of the first published autobiographies of a Native American leader, that became a bestseller and would remain a major figure in the country's popular imagination. Living the rest of his life in Iowa, the state's Hawkeye moniker is perhaps named for him, as were the NHL's Chicago Blackhawks and the Blackhawk helicopter model. U.S. victory in the Black Hawk War, though, initiated a period of Indian removal in the region. Over the next few decades, Dakota, Ho-Chunk, and other tribes in the area were forced further west or south, or their lands shrunk into smaller and smaller reservations. Today, some Meskwaki control a small reservation in Iowa's Tama County, the only reservation in the state. In 1833, not long after the end of the Black Hawk War, white settlers began moving into the region. In 1834, it was made part of the Michigan Territory, Michigan's new bounds stretching all the way to the Missouri River. In 1836, it would change hands again, the western portion of the Michigan Territory becoming the new territory of Wisconsin. Just another 2 years, and it would once again be split off. Everything between the Missouri, White Earth, and Mississippi rivers from Missouri to the south and British lands to the north were made a new territory, named for a tributary of the Mississippi that flowed through it, Iowa. As the federal government captured land further to the west, Americans from the increasingly crowded East Coast made their way across the Appalachians, intrigued by the prospect of open lands free to settle. They came from New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and as they went west, populated the new states of the Midwest, like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. By the 1830s and 40s, these states too were becoming heavily populated. The 1840 census marked Ohio as the third most populous state in the country, remarkable for a place that had gained statehood just a generation prior. From these states too, Americans moved west, and by the 1830s, pioneer families, Northeasterners and Midwesterners alike, were settling in the Iowa Territory. Immigrants came too. Germans, Irish, Norwegians, Dutch, and Swedes sought out land to farm on the prairie. With so few trees on the horizon, many lived in farmhouses built of sod. In the east, towns began to spring up. Dubuque, Burlington, Farmington, Keokuk, Bellevue. Burlington, on the Mississippi River, was named the territory's capital city. Soon, the territorial government decided that they wanted a seat closer to the center of the territory's population. They chose a spot on the Iowa River and named it Iowa City. Though further north, this new capital was still very much in Iowa's east, going to show just how concentrated the territory's population was in the Mississippi Valley. In 1839, a poorly drawn border between Iowa and Missouri led to a border dispute between the states, the bloodless Honey War, named after a Missouri sheriff, chopped down some Iowa beehives. It was eventually settled by the Supreme Court, giving the two states their current borders. By 1840, the territory's population had risen to 43,000 people, mostly living in river towns or farms along the Mississippi. 6 years later, it had reached 100,000. Any territory with over 60,000 people could become a state, and Iowans were clamoring for statehood. New states were being admitted under the Missouri Compromise, which aimed to keep a balanced number of so-called free and slave states in the country, states where slavery had been abolished or was legal, so as to prevent either side of the contentious national issue from having a majority in the Senate. Under the compromise, new states had to be admitted in pairs, one free state with one slave state. With the southern slaveholding territory of Florida also eager for statehood, the two paired their applications for admission. Though the slaveholding Republic of Texas gained statehood between the two, Iowa and Florida would be the last two free and slave states to enter as a pair. While the entire territory sought admission, anti-slavery members of Congress thought it better that multiple free states could be carved out of this huge northern territory, and instead only admitted Iowa's southern portion. The North would eventually comprise parts of Minnesota, including Minneapolis, and both Dakotas. On December 28, 1846, a year after the admission of both Florida and Texas, President James K. Polk signed into law the admission of Iowa into the Union, and it became the country's 29th state. The new state was perfectly positioned to take advantage of the railroad boom that was transforming the U.S., and would expand even further in the decades to come. Rail lines hoped to stretch west, and Chicago, directly east of the state, was positioning itself to be a major rail hub. From Chicago, lines reaching the country's mountain west could travel through Iowa. 4 Iowa towns on the Mississippi River, Dubuque, Clinton, Davenport, and Burlington, built rail companies, each attracting new lines from Chicago. Downriver in St. Louis, a ferry company that had a monopoly transporting cargo and passengers by boat to and from the rail yards on each side of the Mississippi, successfully lobbied against construction of a rail bridge in the city. Passing up on the opportunity, Iowa would beat them to it. The first rail bridge over the country's greatest river would go from Rock Island, Illinois, to Davenport, shifting the heart of the country's rail infrastructure north to Chicago, and allowing Iowa to reap the benefits. By 1860, Iowa had 674,000 people. Its population, larger than both Texas and California, had tripled in just a decade. For an agricultural state, this railroad brought not just new people to Iowa, but allowed them to ship their agricultural products to Midwestern markets like Chicago. Pork and beef could be processed in Chicago's massive stockyards, and Iowa corn and grains sent to eastern markets. The new state was firmly bound into a fast-growing America, and already it was feeding the nation. In 1857, the state, beginning to see more residents push west, chose a new capital city in the center of the state, founding a city on the Des Moines River at the site of Fort Des Moines. They called it Fort Des Moines. Not far across the Mississippi from Fort Madison sat a city called Nauvoo. It was the largest city in Illinois, bigger than even Chicago, but Nauvoo was not your typical city. It was a master-planned religious society. Its mayor, a man named Joseph Smith, believed to be a prophet by his followers. They called themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Popularly, they were known by another name, taken from one of their central texts, Mormons. As Smith's following grew by the tens of thousands, his religious movement, a sharp departure from traditional Christianity, stirred up controversy. It ranged from criticism of polygamy, which Smith and some church leaders practiced, and of the theocratic governance of some church settlements, to outright religious persecution and hatred of Mormon abolitionist beliefs. From their start in upstate New York, Smith and his followers moved to Ohio, then Missouri, before they were pushed out by a violent conflict, the state's governor calling for their extermination, eventually settling in Nauvoo. Now once again, the Mormons would be forced from Illinois. Rising tensions between Mormons and other settlers in Nauvoo saw Smith arrested, jailed in the nearby Illinois town of Carthage. In 1844, a mob raided his prison and killed him. Smith's successor, Brigham Young, led the Mormons west out of Nauvoo in search of a new homeland far from the reach of the United States government. They settled in a part of Mexico that would soon be won by the U.S. following their victory in the Mexican-American War. It would eventually become known as Utah. The trek of the Mormons west to Utah took them right through Iowa. Some 70,000 Mormons would travel across Iowa and further west from there on what became known as the Mormon Trail. Along with the population of Nauvoo, there were also European converts, coming in particular from England, setting off too on the trail towards Utah. Towns would develop along the Mormon Trail as staging grounds to prepare the migrants for the grueling journey westward. A key location was the Mormon town of Kanesville, located on the Iowa side of the Missouri River. It quickly became one of the largest cities in the state. As the waves of Mormon immigrants passed through, more pioneers seeking out life in the American West followed the trail they'd paved. The Mormon population gradually left Kanesville for Utah, but more Americans were passing through, and the city, changing its name to Council Bluffs, continued to grow. In January of 1848, a chance event in a land far to the west continued to cement Iowa's role as a pathway to the west. A man named James Marshall, building a sawmill in the Sierra Nevada for wealthy California landowner John Sutter, discovered gold in the river. Word of the find spread, and by 1849, a full-on gold rush was underway. Hundreds of thousands flocked to California. Their overland route, the California Trail, followed initially the route of the Mormon Trail. Many so-called 49ers headed for California left from Council Bluffs. As hundreds of thousands moved west, some from Iowa, others moved to the state, establishing their own farms, or settling in the fast-growing towns bolstered by the railroads and travel along the western trails. Nationally, war was on the horizon. Tensions over slavery erupted into open conflict after a number of southern states seceded from the Union following the election of anti-slavery President Abraham Lincoln. Iowa remained firmly with the Union. It was a northern state, settled mostly by Americans from the abolitionist Northeast and Midwest, as well as European immigrants from countries like Germany, Norway, Ireland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, who tended to oppose slavery as well. It was part of the Underground Railroad as well. Enslaved black Americans fleeing north from slaveholding Missouri would find refuge in the free state of Iowa. Though Missouri on Iowa's southern border was a slave state, it too had remained with the Union. The Confederacy was far enough away from Iowa that battle never reached its borders. Many Iowans fought for the Union, however, and the state was an essential supplier of food for Union troops. During the war, Lincoln had funded construction of a transcontinental railroad, connecting the west coast at California to existing rail lines in the eastern half of the country. Iowa was a natural starting point, sitting on the edge of the country's populated Midwest. Besides the frontier prairies of the Great Plains, it was developed, settled, and well connected to existing rail lines. The eastern of the two lines named to make up the Transcontinental Railroad was set to begin at Council Bluffs. There was a problem, though. Building a bridge across the wide Missouri River would be difficult. For now, they would begin construction on the other side of the river, in the smaller Nebraska town of Omaha. Though this decision would position Omaha, not Council Bluffs, to be the Transcontinental Railroad's key rail hub, it would nevertheless benefit Iowa to remain such an important link to the country's ever-expanding transportation network. By 1880, Iowa was no longer a frontier, but a heavily populated, industrialized, agricultural powerhouse firmly connected to the rest of the United States. It was a major destination for immigrants. European immigrants from countries like the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, England, Ireland, and in particular Germany, flocked to the state. Many of these immigrants had money saved up to purchase a plot of land. While many poorer immigrants looked for immediate work either in the ports of entry or major industrial cities, many immigrants to Iowa settled on farms in rural parts of the state. By 1880, 1.6 million people lived in Iowa. It was now the 10th most populous state in the country, and would remain so for the next 2 decades. Fort Des Moines, the capital, had shortened its name to just Des Moines. After coal was discovered nearby, the city, connected by rail lines to Chicago, boomed. It had by now surpassed the river towns to the east to become Iowa's largest city, twice the size of the next largest towns: Dubuque, Davenport, Sioux City, Council Bluffs, Cedar Rapids, Burlington, and Clinton. Cities in the west like Council Bluffs and Sioux City were jumping off points for westward migration, whereas Cedar Rapids became a regional center of milling and meatpacking. A Quaker Oats oatmeal mill in the city became the largest mill in the world and remains so to this day. As Iowa industrialized, its farms became more large-scale, switching from largely wheat to corn production to feed livestock. During World War I, Iowa farmers profited off increased production thanks to subsidies from the government, but after the war, many could not afford to pay off those debts and lost their farms. The economic catastrophe of the Great Depression caused another half of Iowan farms to go under. World War II continued to transform the state. Iowa farming became more mechanized and large scale, and manufacturing, particularly of agriculture-related products, took off. As farms became larger and a more mixed economy set in, more Iowans began flocking to the city. Cities like Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, Davenport, and Iowa City became larger and larger as young people left the farms in small towns and congregated in the city. In 1942, at Iowa State College in Ames, a math and physics professor named John Atanasoff and one of his graduate students, Clifford Berry, completed a project they'd been working on for years. As a physics professor, Atanasoff often needed to complete large, complex calculations. On a calculator, this was a tedious process. Atanasoff wanted a machine that could complete larger calculations. After years of development, the two completed what they called the ABC, the Atanasoff-Berry computer. There are disputes over what should be considered the first true computer, but the machine built in a basement in Ames was the first electronic digital computer, at the very least a huge milestone in computer development, if not the first true computer. Their invention would have lasting ramifications. The computer would transform American society, the world, and indeed the human experience in a way few other discoveries ever would. I am writing, recording, and editing, and you are watching this video on a machine that would not exist if not for Atanasoff and Berry's research and invention in Ames, Iowa. In Des Moines, low taxes on insurance premiums led insurance companies to set up shop, and today the city is a major regional center of the insurance industry. Finance, biotech, and other sectors have moved in alongside agriculture. The state would continue to grow, but far more slowly. Other states, particularly in the Sun Belt and West Coast, boomed after the war. A number of states surpassed the Hawkeye State in population, while Iowa slipped more towards the middle of the pack. In 1968, riots at a chaotic Democratic National Convention in Chicago caused the party to implement a number of reforms in how it selected its nominee for the presidency. A number of states, including Iowa, followed suit. Iowa had always held caucuses instead of primaries, a more communal process in which representatives of each candidate have a chance to speak, and voters move between tables to settle on a candidate. But with these reforms, Iowa's caucuses moved to be first in the nation. Primaries and caucuses before these post-1968 reforms had not been the must-win events they are today for presidential candidates, but the Iowa caucus in 1976 changed everything. There, a minor candidate, little known on the national stage, Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, won a surprise victory, propelling him to the forefront of the race and an eventual victory. From then on, other candidates, especially lesser-known ones, have seen victories in the Iowa caucus as essential, and they often narrow the presidential primary field to a few final candidates. From then on, roughly half of the time, the winner of the Iowa caucus has gone on to win their party's nomination, giving the state and its political interests and local issues an outsized influence on the national politics. In 1970, Iowa agricultural scientist Norman Borlaug pioneered a number of agricultural practices and hybridized crops with the goal of allowing farms to significantly boost the amount of food they could produce. Borlaug traveled the world, introducing these farming methods to agricultural societies across the globe, and they are implemented on a massive scale. Dubbed the Green Revolution, Borlaug spearheaded a fundamental transformation of how agriculture is produced, making farming far more productive. He's thought to have saved no less than 1 billion lives, more than any other human being in history. In the 1980s, the U.S. was hit with a devastating farm crisis. In Iowa, a state so dependent on agriculture, it hit particularly hard. Demand for American agriculture abroad had been skyrocketing, and to meet this demand, farmers had borrowed more and more money. Farmers were dependent on borrowing, but as inflation soared in the 1970s, the Federal Reserve responded by making it more expensive to borrow. Farms across the country, including across Iowa, went under. Small towns that revolved around agriculture and other industries that farmers supported were hollowed out. Iowans fled rural Iowa for the cities or left the state altogether. From 1980 to 1990, Iowa's population dropped from 2.9 to 2.77 million, a loss of 137,000 people, some 5% of the state's population. It was the state's most significant ever decline in population. Though the population would recover, small-town Iowa, indeed small-town America, is still struggling. Many rural parts of the state continue to lose residents, while most growth is in suburban Des Moines. Throughout the 1970s, an oil crisis caused by an embargo against the U.S. by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, saw American fuel prices skyrocket in response to shortages. The crisis, though it eventually subsided, led the U.S. to seek alternative sources of fuel. By the early 2000s, ethanol, a fuel that can be made out of corn, was booming, and by 2005, the U.S. was the world's largest ethanol producer. Today, ethanol is often included in gasoline, and it's had a major impact on Iowa. With the state's dominance in corn production, 30% of all ethanol produced in the United States comes from Iowa. In the center of the state, where the Raccoon River meets the Des Moines River, sits Des Moines, Iowa's largest city and capital. 542,000 people live in the city and its surrounding suburbs, including West Des Moines, Ankeny, Urbandale, Polk City, Johnston, and Altoona. With a little over 500,000 in its greater area, it's a smaller city, the 78th largest urban area in the country, with more people than live in and around Akron, Ohio, and fewer than the New Haven, Connecticut area. Still, though, a sixth of all Iowans call the Des Moines area home. Iowa's capital city, located between the flatter north and gently rolling hills of the south, is a lovely city. A center for the insurance industry, downtown is filled with tall buildings, its skyline easily the largest in the state. It's home to the 8 tallest buildings in Iowa, including 801 Grand, or the Principal Building, the tallest skyscraper in the state. Many downtown buildings are, like in neighboring Minnesota, connected by sky bridges to allow pedestrian traffic during Iowa's cold winters. Downtown is home to bars, shops, and restaurants, as well as the Papa John's Sculpture Park, a beautiful sculpture garden. The Des Moines River passes right through downtown, which includes a waterfall, and a series of beautiful low bridges cross over it, which are depicted on the city's flag. On a low hill overlooking downtown is the Iowa Capitol Building. I've been able to visit many of the country's state capitol buildings. It's something I always love to do when I'm visiting a new state, and having seen quite a few of them, I personally think that Iowa's Capitol Building in Des Moines is, along with the capital of neighboring Nebraska, one of the 2 most beautiful state houses in the country. It contains 4 smaller domes on each corner of the building, with one magnificent gold-plated dome over the rotunda. Inside, the building is ornately decorated, with a golden interior that makes it look almost like a palace. The cherry on top, a beautiful hilltop view of Des Moines. The road from the Capitol goes right downtown and provides some excellent views of Iowa's biggest city. The Iowa State Fair, among the biggest state fairs in the country, is located in state fairgrounds in the city. Over 1 million people flock to Des Moines each year for the fair, twice the urban area's population, and more than a third of the state's population. I visited Des Moines as part of my U.S. Explained tour around the country and loved it. It's a beautiful, pleasant city filled with trees, greenery, and great riverfronts that was a wonderful place to get to explore. The city is catching on with people. Since 2020, Iowa's 2 fastest growing counties, Warren and Dallas counties, are both located in suburban Des Moines. The latter has grown at an astonishing 16% since 2020. Polk County, where Des Moines itself is located, is growing too, seeing a 4% increase in population since the last census. In terms of race, 83% of Iowans are white, 7% are Latino, 4% black, 3% multiracial, and 2% Asian American. It is the 6th highest proportion of white Americans of any state. Most Iowans trace their ancestry to Germany, Ireland, England, Norway, Mexico, and the Netherlands. German immigrants in particular had a major influence on the state. A third of all Iowans trace their ancestry to Germany. It's the fifth highest proportion of German Americans, the largest group Americans trace their ancestry back to of any state. In terms of religion, 77% of Iowans are Christian, mostly Protestant. 60% of Iowans are Protestant and 18% Catholic. Classic Iowa foods include the pork tenderloin sandwich, a breaded pork sandwich that you might remember from the Indiana episode, pizza from Casey's, an Iowa gas station that sells taco and breakfast pizzas, the Made Right sandwich, a ground meat sandwich, the hot beef sandwich, which includes beef, gravy, and mashed potatoes, the panino, a loaf of Italian bread baked with sausage, pepperoni, and marinara, steak de Burgo, a Des Moines-style tenderloin steak with herbs, butter, and garlic, sweet corn, of course, and cinnamon rolls topped with chili, which sounds kind of fun, and a number of you mentioned in the comments. Iowans, like many Midwesterners, particularly the more north you go, can have some pretty distinct Midwestern accents, especially in more rural parts of the state. It's not, however, as strong as the accents you'll hear further north in Minnesota, though you'll hear some Minnesota-esque accents near the northern border. Music genres like rock, indie, folk, blues, country, and jazz have had a deep history in the state. The famous painting American Gothic by Iowa artist Grant Wood depicts a fictional Iowa farming family. The farmhouse in the painting, though, is a real farmhouse in Eldon, Iowa. There are no major league sports teams in Iowa, and Iowans tend to root for teams based out of neighboring states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. As is the case in much of the Midwest, especially without major league sports, college sports are huge. Most Iowans root for the University of Iowa Hawkeyes in Iowa City, though the area around Ames tends to root for the Iowa State Cyclones and much of the Missouri Valley for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. College football is particularly huge, but with Iowan basketball great Caitlin Clark coming out of the University of Iowa, women's basketball has become increasingly popular in the state, and during her final season, Hawkeye women's basketball became something of a national phenomenon. The classic baseball movie Field of Dreams is set in Iowa, and the actual field, built right into an Iowa cornfield, has become a legendary sight in baseball, and the MLB has had a few exhibition games there, which became some of the league's most watched regular season games. High school and college wrestling is also super popular across the state. It has a local wrestling scene that's more prominent than few other states, and Iowa's high school state wrestling championships typically sell out an arena in downtown Des Moines. One of the biggest events of the year in Iowa is RAGBRAI, which stands for the Register's Annual Great Bike Ride Across Iowa. This huge multi-day bike ride, hosted by the Des Moines Register, takes riders across the state from the Missouri to the Mississippi and draws some 50,000 people every summer. It's the largest recreational bike ride in the world. Perhaps the most quintessential Iowa event, though, is the State Fair. Now, most Midwestern states, with their strong farm heritage, have amazing state fairs, but Iowa's is hard to beat. The Iowa State Fair is among the most visited in the country, drawing over 1 million people to the fairgrounds in Des Moines for livestock shows, games, hay rides, burlap sack races, and of course an obscene amount of fried food. Iowa's largest newspaper is the Des Moines Register, and its busiest airport is the Des Moines International Airport. Major universities include the University of Iowa in Iowa City, Iowa State in Ames, the Des Moines Area Community College, Drake University in Des Moines, and Grinnell College. Major companies headquartered in the state include Principal Financial, Casey's General Stores, Rockwell Collins, American Equity Investment, Hy-Vee, Come and Go,
United Cooperative,
Transamerica Corporation, Crystal Group, Eurofins, and F&G Annuities and Life. A number of famous or influential people were either born or lived in Iowa, including Johnny Carson, Russell Stover, Buffalo Bill, Elijah Wood, Donna Reed, George Olmsted, Cooper DeJean, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Ashton Kutcher, Black Hawk, Caitlin Clark, Vice President Henry Wallace, Joe Burrow, Glenn Miller, George Gallup, Norman Borlaug, Meredith Wilson, Wyatt Earp, Jason Momoa, Ron Livingston, Pat McLaughlin, the Ringling Brothers, and John Wayne, to name a few. Only one Iowan has ever served as President of the United States. Herbert Hoover was born and raised in West Branch, a small farm town in eastern Iowa. After moving to California to go to Stanford, he began a successful career traveling the world as a mining engineer, living for a time in Australia and China. Nicknamed the Great Humanitarian, his post-business career would see him successfully tackle a number of humanitarian crises, in particular distributing aid during World War I to the war-torn country of Belgium. His humanitarian efforts made Hoover a popular and well-respected figure, and he was selected by President Warren Harding to serve as his Commerce Secretary. He would continue under Harding's successor, Calvin Coolidge, and would manage response efforts after major floods struck the Mississippi River. After his 2 terms as Commerce Secretary, Hoover was elected president as a Republican in 1928. Though he initiated construction of the Colorado River's enormous Hoover Dam, which was named for him, his presidency would not be an easy time. The Great Depression struck early into his term, and many Americans were critical of his handling of the economic calamity. He was defeated in a landslide in his bid for re-election by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hoover's presidential library is located in West Branch, still a tiny village, right across the street from his childhood home. Like I mentioned earlier, the Iowa caucus has made the state for decades one of the most important political players in the country. Roughly half of the caucus winners have gone on to be the nominee. The caucus typically winnows the presidential field significantly. Candidates hope to be one of the few to get their ticket punched out of Iowa. There's typically lower voter turnout with the multi-hour caucus format, and Iowa is a smaller rural state with a single media market. Because of this, candidates without a major national profile really do have an opportunity to make themselves known in Iowa, and the state gets a ton of attention from primary candidates. Presidential hopefuls descend on events like the state fair, chowing down on fried food and taking pictures with as many voters as possible. Hopefuls will flock to the state years before any voting will even take place. Some even try to visit all of Iowa's 99 counties. Iowa becomes shorthand for the real start of election season. It and the country's first primary, New Hampshire, become nationally watched events. There's usually at least one presidential debate held in Iowa, and the Des Moines Register has become a major reporter of presidential primary news, as well as a prominent conductor of statewide political polls. On top of that, Iowa was for a long time a key swing state. Al Gore won the state in 2000, while George W. Bush did the following election in 2004, each by a margin of less than 1%. Barack Obama carried the state in both 2008 and 2012. Iowa has since turned in a sharply conservative direction and is now a solidly red state, with a Cook PVI of R+6, meaning that in a given presidential election, the Republican nominee tends to outperform their national average by about 6% in Iowa. Previously, eastern Iowa was more liberal and western Iowa more conservative. With the rise of Donald Trump, however, most of the state's rural areas have begun to uniformly vote Republican, and while the state's cities tend to vote for Democrats, the cities are small enough that the last few elections in the state have not been very competitive. It appears to be trending redder. Trump won Iowa by 9 points in 2016, 11 in 2020, and 13 in 2024. Of Iowa's 4 representatives in the House of Representatives, each are Republicans. The state's governor, Kim Reynolds, is a Republican, as are its 2 senators, Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst. Grassley, at 91 years old, is the oldest member of the Senate. He's been in Congress for 50 years, making him the longest-serving current senator and longest-serving Republican congressman ever. The longest-serving current senator, called the Dean of the Senate, typically serves as the Senate pro tempore, a position which Grassley holds. As pro tem, he's third in the line of succession to the presidency after just the vice president and speaker of the House. That's it for Iowa. Up next, we've got the great state of Wisconsin. If you're from Wisconsin, please respond to my community post or my comment here to let me know what you'd like to see included about your home state. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's already joined my Patreon. Through it, you can access different things such as quarterly channel newsletters, thumbnail previews, early access to maps I create, and shoutouts to my videos such as these. Also, please subscribe to my brother's channel, Quinn the Cameraman. He made the great intro at the beginning of this video that I use in all US Explained videos, so go show him some support. I tried to be pretty thorough with this video, but I know there were definitely things I missed as there was a lot to talk about. I want to give a big thank you to everyone from Iowa who helped give me information for this video. I truly would not have been able to make this video without all your help. I really enjoyed visiting Iowa as part of my 6-month-long filmmaking trip across the country. From here on out, every single video in the US Explained will feature on-site clips and footage I filmed in that state. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.